The young and the restless spoilers shock. The whispers around Genoa City had already made Victoria feel as if she were standing on a crumbling cliff, with the tide pulling harder every day. Her stubborn loyalty to Claire had placed her at odds with nearly everyone she trusted. Boardroom allies, family members, even her children only by one, they began to doubt her judgment. She insisted Claire was misunderstood, maligned, and fairly judged, and she clung to that narrative with the same ferocity that had once kept Newman Enterprises from collapsing under hostile takeovers. But this was different. Every fresh scandal, every new whisper, every subtle inconsistency in Claire's stories left Victoria more isolated. And still, she would not let go. The cost of defending Claire seemed to grow heavier by the hour. What Victoria couldn't anticipate was the return of someone who carried both her past and her deepest wounds, a man whose very name evoked scars that had never fully healed. Many speculated it would be Billy, her reckless ex-husband whose patterns of self-destruct mirrored her own blind spots. Others assumed Ashland, whose death had been shrouded in as much mystery as his life, would somehow rise from the ashes to haunt her. But the truth was more shocking, more unsettling, and infinitely more dangerous. J.T. Hallstrom was alive. The man who had once been her lover, her husband, and eventually her tormentor, man who had been presumed gone for good, rather not to reconcile but to reveal. J.T.'s presence alone was enough to shake Victoria to her core. He embodied unresolved trauma, anger that had been left to fester, and a history that was as tragic as it was volatile. His return was not laced with apologies or pleas for forgiveness. It was driven by something darker, sharper mission. For J.T. had pieced together fragments of truth that others ignored, the cracks in Claire's carefully curated mask of innocence. Where others saw misunderstood young woman, J.T. saw manipulation. Where others pitied her fragility, he saw calculation. And now, armed with information no one else dared pursue, J.T. was prepared to shatter Claire's facade in the most public, irreversible way possible. For Claire, the danger was sudden and suffocating. She had perfected her act, wide eyes of a victim, the soft voice, the gentle gestures that invited sympathy rather than suspicion. It had worked on almost everyone, and Victoria had been her most powerful shield, ready to cut down any who dared question her. But J.T.'s return changed the balance entirely. His words carried weight not because he was trusted, but because he had no reason to protect her. His history with Victoria ensured that his motives would be questioned, but his evidence, if he truly had it, would be impossible to ignore. The very thought of facing him forced Claire into a rare position of vulnerability. If she lost control even for a moment, if she snapped or overplayed her hand, the mask would crack and the truth would spill out. For Victoria, the shock was nearly unbearable. To see J.T. again was to relive 1,000 memories she had buried, both the tenderness that once made her love him and the darkness that had nearly destroyed her. Now, he stood as both ghost and executioner, holding truths that could dismantle the fragile defense she had built around Claire. The conflict tore at her. Was J.T. back for vengeance, for justice, or for another twisted game? Could she trust even a fragment of what he claimed, or was she simply stepping into yet another trap? But beneath the doubt and fear was a grim certainty. Victoria could not ignore him. If J.T. truly had the power to expose Claire, then she would be forced to choose between protecting the woman she had so fiercely defended and facing the avalanche of evidence that could ruin them both. The path forward promised chaos no matter what she chose, but one thing was undeniable: the return of J.T. Hallstrom was about to rip open every wound, every lie, every fragile bond, and no one in Genoa City would escape unscathed. J.T. Hallstrom didn't come back to Genoa City to be forgiven. He came back to be believed, and the difference mattered from the first breath he took on Newman soil. He didn't ask for a seat, didn't request a private audience or a polite hearing. He walked straight into the brittle center of Victoria's life and laid his accusation down like a blade. Claire was an imposter. Not her biological daughter, a counterfeit built from forged documents, doctored hospital logs, and a choreography of tears timed to the exact moment Victoria's guilt and maternal longing would be most malleable. If Victoria wanted proof, and he knew she J.T. was prepared to commission an independent DNA analysis, chain of custody documented to the millimeter. No Newman labs, no Newman money, no Newman favors. The room changed temperature when he said Jordan's name. Jordan, the shadow puppeteer who had once rewritten the geometry of the Newman family, was more than a ghost in this version of events. She was blood. She was the mother Claire didn't claim, the origin of the obsession Claire disguised as redemption, the secret Claire buried so deeply that rumor had to grow roots in darkness to reach it. And if JT's timeline was right, Claire hadn't merely severed herself from that origin, she had eliminated the one person who could still draw a straight line from the earliest fraud to the newest inheritance. Turning I survived into No One Can Contradict Me, it was not a story designed to elicit sympathy for JT, or even for Victoria. It was a case file wrapped in personal history, and he delivered it with the cold, stripped cadence of a man who expects to be hated but refuses to be ignored. Victoria listened with the posture of a woman who had trained herself not to flinch. For months she had sponsored Claire's innocence with her own credibility, shielding the younger woman from boardroom suspicion and family backlash, insisting that trauma had misrepresented itself as malice. She had worn that argument like armor, and it had cost her sideways glances from the Newman board, careful platitudes from Nikki, the stoic calculation in Victor's eyes whenever the topic turned to succession. Now JT was asking her to pivot from maternal absolution to criminal suspicion, to recast Claire's softness as stagecraft and her slips as strategy, to believe that the girl she had vowed to protect had rehearsed the perfect performance of being Victoria Newman's lost child in order to secure proximity to a throne. The paradox cut both ways. Victoria didn't trust JT with her heart or her history. She trusted him with the anatomy of obsession. He had taught her, brutally, how love can be weaponized, how intimacy can disguise surveillance, how a caress can be a cage. If anyone could diagram the shape of a charming predator, it was the man who had nearly become one and learned, inch by inch, to recognize the monster in the mirror. That didn't absolve him, and it didn't absolve the pain he had left behind, but it made his map hard to throw away. So she did the only thing a Newman can do when the past and the present both demand tribute. She compartmentalized. She told him he would get his test, but it would be clean, and she would be there to watch the vial sealed, and the seal signed, and the career tracked. And if he was wrong, if one more independent lab affirmed what she had already chosen to believe, then he would never speak Claire's name to her again. Claire heard the rumor before she heard the plan. Genoa City is a small town with global money, and fear travels faster than press releases. She felt it in the way the Jabot receptionist said good morning with too much carefulness, in the pause between sentences when Carl told her he'd be late to lunch, in the phantom buzz of a phone that had gone quiet because people had stopped gambling on which version of her would answer. The precision of JT's assertions rattled her, not because she hadn't anticipated suspicion, but because she had underestimated the one man who could thread suspicion through the eye of a needle and make it look like a tapestry. She had crafted an origin that could pass casual scrutiny. Hospital records altered where the system was leaky. Midwife's affidavit acquired in a place where affidavits were commodities. A trail of bank checks that layered charity over coordination. She had even prepped for DNA, because anyone playing for Newman stakes learns to fear laboratories. But her preparations leaned on control of timing, of personnel, of chain of custody tucked into the pocket of a friendly insider. JT's promise of a third-party chain that neither Newman nor Claire could contaminate was a different kind of storm. She could not charm a barcoded envelope or cry her way past a tamper-evident seal. She could only wait, and waiting was not a skill she admired in herself. The timing made everything worse, because ambition is a calendar as much as it is a motive. Claire had been positioning herself not just as Kyle's partner in public, but as his indispensably rational counterpart in private, as one who smoothed his romantic impulsivity into corporate discipline, the one who knew how to turn a sales win into a systems improvement, the one who understood that Jabot needed a next era that wasn't just a new flavor of Abbott nostalgia. She didn't have to say she saw herself in the boardroom to be seen there. She just had to be the person in the notes app who already had the motion drafted when the chair called for one. Her project plans had dates that aligned a little too perfectly with the afterglow of a wedding toast. Her speeches about continuity wore an engagement ring's promise like a watermark. She wasn't shy about the scope of her goal. She wanted the name, the power, the corridor respect that makes doors open before you knock. She wanted what certain women in Genoa City learned to want early, the right to define the center. JT's reappearance threatened her not because it risked a headline, but because it endangered the math of her ascent. A scandal now would move votes, and the votes would move the chair. And the chair was the path to the signature block that approved everything else. Kyle wasn't the only vector. Jack's antennae, tuned by decades of Newman warfare and internal family mutiny, had already been vibrating around Clary, admiration curdled by unease. The feeling that someone had memorized his house's creaks a little too fast. Diane's elegance made her dangerous in different ways. She could smile while tightening a drawstring around your plan. And when she pressed Claire with pleasantly bland questions about purchasing cadence and lab throughput, Claire felt the audit under the etiquette. Ashley, too, doesn't do innocence, she does engineering, and engineering looks at behavior like load-bearing walls. Add Summer's history with Kyle and Audra's appetite for other people's fragility, and the environment around Claire had become a pressure chamber. JT detonated the chamber by introducing oxygen in exactly the wrong place. He didn't need Claire to be guilty of murder for the accusation to work. He needed her to look like someone who could be. He hinted at Jordan's death like a rumor of heat in a room full of paper. He suggested opportunity, motive disguised as emancipation. A fight in a motel with hall cameras that had suspiciously failed a maintenance check and a coroner's note with an undetermined that could be teased toward homicide with a little sunlight. He didn't show Victoria photographs in that first meeting. He showed her the names of people willing to show them later, under oath. Victoria's instincts split and fused in the same heartbeat. Every part of her that had bent toward Claire with maternal ferocity reared back, angry at the humiliation of being played. Every part of her that had learned to interrogate evidence wanted more. She could admit, privately, that Claire's perfection had sometimes felt like a lab-assembled alibi, right stumbles at the right times, the right vulnerability deployed to the right Newman audience, the right gratitude that smelled more like rehearsal than shock. But she could also admit that JT has a talent for drafting reality in his own syntax. So she sent a message that would terrify anyone whose paperwork has seams: independent test, third-party courier, New York lab with no Genoa City vendor ties, a camera on the draw, a lawyer on the chain, results handed to her first and to JT second. She chose the site herself, booked the room under a decoy, and told Claire that consent was the path through. Claire didn't argue. She smiled small, said yes, and left claw marks in her palm where no one could see them. The day of the test felt like arbitration with God. Nikki watched the doors with a stillness that looks like grace until you see the vein in her wrist. Victor said little because words are weapons, and he does not brandish too many at once. He made a call to a man who knows labs in order to know which labs not to call. Jack offered to accompany Victoria because Abbott protection sometimes arrives as a handshake in a hall. Diane texted Kyle exactly once, no rash decisions. Billy didn't come because his life had broken open in other ways. But his unsent message to Victoria read like the brother he tries to be when he remembers how. JT stood where he could see but not intrude, a sentinel of his own making. The phlebotomist was the kind of person these procedures require: polite, forgettable, excellent. Vials filled, caps clicked, labels printed with code instead of names, evidence tape laid like a boundary no one in that room would cross without bleeding trust. Victoria signed the edge of each seal like a promise made to herself, and when the courier walked away with the package, the building exhaled a breath no one admitted holding. In the interim days when the world still turns but everyone you know keeps glancing at their phone to make sure the world hasn't jumped tracks, Claire moved like a dancer on a cracked stage. She doubled down on normal. She brought Kyle a coffee with the meticulousness of someone who knows his order well enough to be in his morning. She briefed a product team on pilot risks with such quiet command that a jaded senior engineer actually took notes. She sent Victoria a short text that thanked her for choosing signals over noise, a phrase calculated to fit the ear of a woman who runs companies. But panic makes its own weather system, and people who live on deceit learn to smell barometric shifts better than most. Audra sniffed a headline and postponed a meeting just long enough to appear later with an idea that would become leverage if she needed it. Summer, who has spent enough of her life losing the things she wants, watched Claire the way a diver watches a riptide looking for the pattern that tells you who goes under. Jack began quietly auditing any process where Claire had access without friction. Diane rehearsed the sentence she would use if the worst version of the truth arrived, and she had to pretend she was hearing it for the first time. The results did not arrive with fanfare. They arrived as a sealed envelope at an office that had never received mail from that lab before. Hand-delivered to a receptionist who had been told to say she needed ID she had never asked for in her life. Victoria opened it alone. She did not cry because the body only has so much water and she had been rationing hers for months. She did not scream because screaming is a performance and she was out of theater. She read the language twice, then a third time, translating the careful prose of certainty into the guttural monosyllable of truth. No maternal match. Not a partial, not a mosaic, not a clerical error's cruel joke. 0. She forwarded a copy to a lawyer whose only job was to know how to approach a prosecutor without triggering a stampede. Then she texted JT. One sentence and Jack a different one. JT's read, "We do this by the book." Jack's read, "I need a private room at Jabbit." What followed wasn't a confrontation so much as a controlled demolition. Claire walked into a conference room calibrated for mercy and found justice waiting in a chair. Jack was there because the Abbott name is a fire break when corporate panic starts to burn. Victoria was there because the lie had been told to her body first. JT was there because he had brought a match to a fuse and stayed long enough to make sure the blast took out the right wall. Kyle arrived late, which is sometimes how fate protects tenderness. Victoria put the paper on the table and didn't unfold it all the way. She said Claire's name the way you say a diagnosis to a patient you love. Claire didn't reach for the paper because people who build labyrinths learn never to let the thread leave their hand. For a breath, she considered confession surgical one, the kind that admits enough to earn a plea without ceding the spine of her ambition. But ambition doesn't thrive on contrition, it feeds on momentum. So she tried a different instrument, boys. She said there must be an error, suggested a third test, offered a chain from a lab she trusted in Chicago, misplayed the word trusted where the word independent was required. JT didn't correct her. He watched the tremor in her jaw and understood that for the first time in months, the performance wasn't rehearsed. The call variable mattered because love is the only currency that can pay a debt like this quickly. He looked at Claire and saw every gentle morning, every work-night grin, every smart answer to a question he didn't know he had. He also saw Harrison's face and realized that the skill set required to be the kind of stepmother he imagined was not the same skill set Claire had brought into this room. He asked the worst question in the best possible tone. Why? Claire could have said survival. She could have said that being the child of a phantom yields a hunger that no ordinary life can sate. That proximity to power feels like oxygen when you grow up learning that your name buys you nothing at doors that matter. Instead, she said something truer and colder. She wanted the life she had built in her head to become the life everyone else had to live in. She wanted the house code and the board badge and the intangibles that make a town like Genoa City orbit you as if you were the fixed star. She didn't want to beg for respect. She wanted to reset the constellation so that the respect flowed toward her by default. JT took that as both confession and forecast. It moved quickly after that because powerful families only know to speed stenial and decision. Newman moved to protect its flank. Council retained statements drafted that used the fewest adjectives. Internal review announced not because it would find anything no one already knew but because optics are also infrastructure. Jabbit did a different math. Jack convened a subcommittee whose title sounded bureaucratic and whose authority was surgical. Diane sat in, silent until the moment came to say, "We will not be led. We will lead," a sentence that reads like a slogan and works like a shield. Kyle recused himself from any vote that touched Claire because love can contaminate governance, and he had finally learned the hard way. Summer did not gloat because people who have been on every side of betrayal recognize the look of someone being torn from their dream like skin from a wound. Audra filed the knowledge away like currency and spent none of it yet. Patience can be predation's most elegant attire.